There is an image that nobody talks about, not in the documentaries, not in the biographies, not in any of the thousands of hours of footage and interviews and retrospectives that have been made about the life and death of Elvis Presley. It is a quiet image, almost unbearably quiet, and it goes like this. An old man sits alone in a small office inside the most famous private home in America. Every morning, without fail, he walks through the door, settles into his chair, leans back, puts his feet up on the desk, and stares. He does not make phone calls. He does not shuffle papers. He does not fill the silence with noise the way most people do when grief gets too heavy to hold. He just stares straight through the large picture window in front of him, out across the back of the property, to the place in the garden where his son is buried. He does this for hours. He does this every single day. And the look on his face is not the look of a man who is mourning. It is the look of a man who knows something. That man is Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, the man who was there before the fame, before the screaming crowds, before the gold records and the movie deals and the sold-out shows that made his boy the most electrifying performer the world had ever seen. Vernon was there for all of it, and then he was there for the end of it. And what he carried in the years after that end, what he held inside that stare as he looked out at that garden every morning, was not just grief. It was something heavier than grief, something darker, something that, for a very long time, only a handful of people in the world were allowed to know. This is not a conspiracy theory. Let's be clear about that from the very beginning, because this story deserves more than that framing. This is not something pieced together from anonymous sources or online forums or the kind of speculation that swirls around any famous death and never quite goes away. What you are about to hear is what Elvis Presley's own father said out loud, in his own words, face to face, to a member of his own family. No intermediaries, no second-hand accounts. No room for misinterpretation. Vernon Presley looked his niece in the eyes and told her what he believed happened to his son, and what he said was not what any of them were prepared to hear. Her name is Donna Presley, and in January of 1979, roughly a year and a half after Elvis died, she came to work at Graceland. Her desk was placed right next to Vernon's. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it means that every single morning, Donna showed up and sat down next to a man who was quietly being destroyed from the inside. She watched him walk through that door. She watched him ease into his chair. She watched his eyes find that window, find that garden, find that grave, and stay there. The two of them would talk sometimes, the way people do when they share a space and a history and a loss. But there were long stretches of silence too, stretches where Vernon simply existed inside whatever it was he was carrying, and Donna understood enough not to fill that silence with anything. Here is what you need to understand about Vernon Presley before this story goes any further. He was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He was not the kind of father who expressed himself in long emotional speeches or openly wore his heart on his sleeve. He was firm. He was stern. He was the kind of man whose approval you had to earn, and whose words, when he chose to use them, meant something precisely because he didn't use them carelessly. People who knew him have described a man of sharp instincts and careful observation, someone who noticed things others walked right past, who paid attention to the details that most people never even registered. For decades, he had walked alongside his son every day. He had watched over Elvis not the way a manager watches over a client, but the way a father watches over a child, even when that child is a grown man, even when that child is one of the most famous human beings alive. To Vernon, none of that changed what Elvis was to him. He was still his boy. He was still the thing he loved most in the world. And now that boy was gone, and Vernon believed, quietly, privately, with absolute and terrible certainty, that someone had taken him. Donna has spoken about the shift in their relationship during those months she worked beside him. What started as the slightly intimidating dynamic between a young niece and a formidable uncle gradually became something different, something more honest, more equal, the kind of connection that sometimes forms between people when they are both surviving the same loss, and there is no longer any point in pretending that everything is fine. She came to see him not just as the stern patriarch of the Presley family, but as a man, a real man with a real wound, sitting alone every morning and staring at the place where the wound began. It was during one of their conversations, ordinary on the surface, the way the most extraordinary moments almost always are, that Vernon said what he said. He was not building toward it. He was not setting a scene or asking her to brace herself. He just said it in the blunt and unvarnished way that was entirely his own, with a word or two in there that Donna felt she needed to warn people about before repeating, because this was not Vernon's usual language. Which is exactly what made it land the way it did. When a man who chooses his words carefully starts using words he never uses, you understand that what he is expressing is beyond the normal range of what he knows how to contain. He told her he couldn't believe that these people were still out here, still walking around, still breathing and moving through the world, while his baby was lying out there in the ground. Donna's first instinct was compassion. She heard it as grief, raw and unfiltered, the kind that sometimes needs to put a face on its pain. She had seen what losing Elvis had done to this family. She understood what it meant for Vernon specifically, because Elvis was not just his first child, he was his only surviving child. Vernon and Gladys had lost a boy at birth, Elvis's twin brother Jesse, before Elvis ever drew his first breath. The weight of that loss had lived in the family for decades, and now the child who had lived, who had thrived, who had become everything, was gone too. Of course Vernon wanted someone to blame. Of course his grief was looking for a shape to take. That was what Donna told herself in that moment, that this was a father's pain finding its way out. And then Vernon looked at her and said, "No, you're not hearing me." Those 5 words changed everything, because in them was something that grief alone cannot produce: precision, intention, the particular tone of a man who is not venting but disclosing. Donna felt it. She has said she felt it immediately, that shift in the air between them, that sudden understanding that this conversation had just become something else entirely, something she was not sure she was ready for. She was right to feel that way, because what came next, what Vernon said in the next breath, slowly and deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was putting into the world by saying it, was not the lament of a grieving father. It was the conclusion of a man who had been watching and thinking and sitting with this for 18 months, and had finally decided that someone in his family needed to know what he believed. What he believed was that Elvis Presley did not simply die. What he believed was that someone made it happen. And before this story is finished, you will understand why Donna never called the police. You will understand why her own mother, the moment she heard what Vernon had said, told her to forget about it and never bring it up again. You will understand why Elvis's grandmother, a woman who loved that boy with every part of herself, already knew and offered the exact same instruction: leave it alone. You will understand why a family that had every reason to want justice made a collective, deliberate choice to pursue something else entirely, something quieter, something older, something that aligned with exactly what Elvis himself had once said about what should happen if anyone ever came for him. And somewhere underneath all of that, underneath the silence and the sealed papers and the private suspicions of a father who took most of what he knew to his grave, there is a question that has never been fully answered. Maybe it never will be. Maybe the truth, if there is a single clean truth to find, is locked inside a set of documents that Vernon himself ordered sealed for 50 years. Documents that, as of right now, are less than 2 years away from being opened. What is in them, nobody outside of that circle knows. Whether they contain a name, a confrontation, a confession, or simply the private anguish of a man who suspected everything and could prove nothing, that remains to be seen. What is not in question is what Vernon said. What is not in question is that he said it clearly and meant it completely, and that the family around him knew enough to be afraid. That is where this story begins. To understand what Vernon Presley said that day, you first have to understand where he said it, because place matters in a story like this. The setting is not incidental, it is everything. It is the thing that turns a conversation into a confession, and a confession into something you carry with you for the rest of your life. Graceland is many things to many people. To the world, it is a landmark, a pilgrimage site, a museum, a monument to one of the most singular careers in the history of American music. Millions of people have walked through those gates and felt something they could not quite name, something between reverence and heartbreak, the particular feeling you get when you are standing inside the life of someone who burned that brightly and is no longer here. But in January of 1979, Graceland was not yet a museum. It had not yet been opened to the public. It was still, in the most fundamental sense, a home. A home where people lived. A home where people grieved. A home where the absence of one person made every room feel smaller than it used to be. The offices on the property were modest in the way that working spaces inside grand homes often are functional, unassuming, designed for the practical business of running a life rather than for impressing anyone. Donna's desk was positioned right next to Vernon's. Not across the room, not down the hall, right next to his. Close enough that when he sat down in the morning, she could hear him settle into the chair. Close enough that the silence between them, on the days when neither of them spoke, was a shared silence rather than two separate ones. And dominating one wall of that office was a large picture window, wide, unobstructed, and aligned with the kind of cruel precision that nobody would have chosen on purpose, in a direct line of sight to the meditation garden at the back of the property, the garden where Elvis had been laid to rest just over a year before Donna arrived. Vernon did not avoid the window, he sought it. Every single morning, without variation, he would come through the door, move to his desk, lean back in his chair, put his feet up and turn his gaze toward that glass. And then he would stay there, not for a few minutes, not for the length of a cup of coffee, for hours. Long, unbroken stretches of time in which he did nothing except look out at the place where his son was buried. The people around him learned not to disturb it. They learned to read it for what it was, not vacancy, not absent-mindedness, but something fierce and interior, a man conducting an ongoing reckoning with something that had no resolution and no end. Donna has described those mornings with the kind of specificity that only comes from living inside a memory for decades and turning it over so many times that every detail has been worn smooth and certain. She remembers the way the light came through that window. She remembers the quality of the quiet. She remembers learning, slowly, that her role in that office was not just to answer fan mail and manage correspondence. It was, in some unspoken way, simply to be present. To be another human being in the room, while Vernon Presley did the impossible work of continuing to exist in a world that no longer contained his son. What made the situation carry its own particular weight was how well Donna understood what Vernon had lost, not just in the abstract way that the world understood it, but in the specific, familial way that only people inside the story could truly know. Because Elvis was not simply Vernon's only surviving child in the way that phrase sounds when you say it quickly and move on. There was a history behind it. A grief that predated Elvis's death by decades, that had lived quietly in the bones of this family since long before any of them became famous. Vernon and Gladys had lost a son the same night Elvis was born, a twin brother, Jesse Garon, who came into the world and left it in the same breath. Vernon had known, from the very first moment of Elvis's life, what it was to lose a child. He had buried one boy before that boy ever had a chance to become anything. And now he had buried the other, the one who had lived, the one who had grown, the one who had become so much more than any of them had ever dared to imagine was possible. To grieve a child once is something no parent should have to survive. To do it twice is a different category of devastation altogether. And to do it the second time while believing, as Vernon did, that the death was not natural, not inevitable, not the sad but ordinary conclusion of a body that had been pushed too hard for too long, that is the kind of weight that changes a person at the cellular level. You could see it in the way he breathed. Donna has said this. Every breath Vernon took in those months, after Elvis died, seemed effortful, deliberate, as though the act of continuing to draw air into his lungs required a decision he was not entirely sure he wanted to keep making. And yet he came in every morning. He sat down at that desk. He turned toward that window. He kept showing up in a world that had taken the most important thing in it from him, and he did it with that look on his face, the one that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but somewhere in the territory between them where the most dangerous thoughts tend to live. Donna came to know him during this period in a way she had not known him before. The dynamic between them shifted gradually, the way these things do, not through any single conversation or deliberate decision, but through the accumulation of ordinary mornings spent side by side, through the gradual erosion of the distance that titles and family hierarchy create between people. She had always respected him. She had always, truthfully, been a little afraid of him in the way that you are afraid of someone whose opinion of you matters, and who does not offer their approval easily. Vernon was not the kind of man who made people feel comfortable by softening his edges or smoothing over the hard things. He said what he meant. He expected people around him to hold themselves to a standard, and he had very little patience for anything that felt false or performed. But sitting beside him in that office, day after day, Donna stopped being just a young niece, and he stopped being just the formidable head of the family. They became, in the way that grief sometimes forces people to become, simply two human beings occupying the same loss from different angles. And that shift, that quiet leveling of the ground between them, is what made it possible for Vernon to eventually say what he said. It happened on a day that began like every other one. Donna arrived, sat down, began the work in front of her. Vernon came in, settled into his chair, found the window. They talked the way they often did, not about anything particular, not about anything that would have seemed, from the outside, like the prelude to a moment that would change everything. And then Vernon said what he said about the people who were still walking around while his baby was in the ground. Donna heard it as a father's pain finding its voice. She responded the way you respond when you are watching someone grieve and you want them to know you are there, with warmth, with agreement, with the gentle acknowledgement that yes, it was awful, yes, it was sad, yes, the loss was beyond what words could hold. And Vernon stopped her, not unkindly, but completely. He told her she wasn't hearing him, and the way he said it, the particular flatness of it, the steadiness, made Donna go quiet in a way she had not expected, because this was not a man who spoke imprecisely. This was not a man who chose a word like hearing when he meant something else. If he said she was not hearing him, it meant something specific had been said that she had not yet received correctly. It meant he was not venting. It meant he was not speaking loosely from a place of grief that needed somewhere to go. It meant there was a specific thing he was communicating, and she had missed it, and he needed her to go back and find it. The air in the room changed. Donna has described it this way, a shift, almost physical, in the quality of the space between them. The morning light through that picture window, the garden visible beyond it, the silence that followed his words sitting between them like something solid. She told him she guessed she wasn't hearing him. She asked him to help her understand. And in the next breath, with no preamble, with no attempt to soften what he was about to put into the world, Vernon Presley told her exactly what he meant. The word he used was not suspicious. It was not strange or wrong or any of the careful, deniable language that people reach for when they want to say something without fully committing to it. Vernon committed. He had clearly been sitting with this long enough that the time for careful language was behind him. He looked at his niece, the young woman sitting at the desk beside his, and he told her plainly that he believed there had been foul play involved in Elvis's death. And then he said the word that made it undeniable. He called it a murder. There are words that once spoken cannot be taken back, not because the person who said them changes their mind, but because the person who heard them is permanently altered by having heard them. The word lands, and something shifts inside you, and no matter what comes after, no matter how much time passes or how many other things fill the space between that moment and the rest of your life, you never fully return to who you were before it was said. Vernon Presley said that word to his niece on an ordinary morning in an office at Graceland, with the Tennessee light coming through the window and his son's grave visible just beyond the glass. And from that moment forward, Donna Presley carried something that most people spend their entire lives never having to carry at all. He called it murder. Not an accident, not a tragedy, not the sad, complicated, medically ambiguous ending that the official record had settled on, a heart that had been strained too long by too many things and finally gave out on a hot August afternoon in 1977. Vernon Presley looked at his niece and used the specific word that changes everything, the word that transforms a death into a crime, a loss into an act, a victim into a target. He said it clearly, and he said it with the full weight of a man who had not arrived at it carelessly or quickly. This was not a momentary eruption of grief looking for somewhere to land. This was a conclusion. This was what Vernon Presley had been sitting with, alone, behind that picture window, for 18 months. Donna's first instinct was the instinct of someone who loves the person in front of them and cannot immediately absorb what they are hearing. She reached for the phone. It was a reflexive, practical, entirely human response. If someone has committed a crime, you call the people whose job it is to investigate crimes. That is what you do. That is what any reasonable person does when they are sitting across from a grieving father who has just told them his son was murdered. Her hand was already moving before her mind had fully caught up with the weight of what she was doing. Vernon stopped her before she could dial, not with alarm, with authority. He told her to put the phone down. She hesitated, still operating on the logic of someone who believed that truth plus the right phone call equals justice. He told her again, put the phone down. And the way he said it, the second time, made it clear that this was not a suggestion, and it was not open to discussion. And if she made that call, she would be doing something that went directly against everything he had already decided about how this was going to be handled. She put the phone down. And then Vernon said something that opened a door into a different understanding of what she had just walked into. He told her he wanted it handled the way Elvis would have wanted it handled. In-house. Those words in-house were not decorative. They were not vague. They carried a specific meaning that Donna understood immediately because she had been part of this family and this world long enough to know exactly what they pointed to. And what they pointed to was a conversation she already knew about, a moment from Elvis's life that the people close to him had never forgotten. There had been a time, not long before the end, when Elvis received a serious threat, credible enough that the FBI had been brought in, credible enough that the possibility of someone trying to shoot him on stage had been treated as a genuine and present danger rather than the kind of noise that famous people learn to filter out over the course of a career. Elvis had gathered the men around him and told them directly what he wanted to happen if the worst came to pass. He was not ambiguous about it. He told them that if someone got to him, he wanted them gotten in return. His exact reasoning was as clear as it was chilling. He did not want anyone walking around in this world becoming famous for killing Elvis Presley. He would not give whoever came for him that. He would not let his death be someone's legacy. Vernon had been there. Vernon had heard it. And when he sat across from Donna and told her he wanted it handled the way Elvis would have wanted, he was not speaking in metaphor. He was invoking a specific instruction that Elvis himself had given, and he was telling her, without spelling it out any further than he needed to, that he intended to honor it. Whatever he knew, whatever he suspected, whatever private investigation he had either already undertaken or was planning, none of it was going to involve the police. None of it was going to involve courts or press conferences or public accusations. It was going to be handled in the dark, by people he trusted, in a manner consistent with the man whose death he was trying to address. The full implication of this settled over Donna slowly. She asked him if he was sure. He said yes. And then he told her something that pushed the conversation into even darker territory. He told her he had already said too much, and that he did not want her involved any further, and that the reason he did not want her involved was specifically because he wanted her protected. That word, protected, was not thrown in casually. A man who wants to protect someone from a conversation is a man who believes the conversation carries genuine danger. Vernon Presley was not being dramatic. Vernon Presley was being careful, in the deliberate and precise way he was careful about everything, and the care he was taking was the care of someone who understood that what he was sitting on was not just painful, it was dangerous. He told her not to say anything to anyone. He told her he had already given her more than he should have. And then, with the quiet finality of a man who has made peace with a decision that cost him everything to arrive at, he closed the subject. Not because there was nothing more to say, but because he had decided that saying more would put her at risk. And whatever else Vernon Presley was, he was a man who protected the people he loved, even when protecting them meant carrying the thing that was destroying him entirely alone. Donna left the office at lunchtime. She walked back across the Graceland grounds to her mother's trailer. Her parents had lived on the property for years, a quiet domestic world existing in the shadow of the famous one, and she sat down and she told her mother what Vernon had said. She could not hold it. She was not built to hold something like that alone, not yet, not without telling at least one person who would understand what it meant. Her mother's response was immediate and absolute. Leave it alone. Not let's think about this or let's be careful or that's troubling. We should figure out what to do. Leave it alone, forget it. Let Vernon handle it. And then her mother said the sentence that has lived in Donna's memory ever since, the sentence that reframed everything she had just heard from a family matter into something much larger and much more frightening. She said, if they can get to Elvis, they can get to anybody. And she reminded Donna that she had two small children at home, two small children who needed their mother. And that was the end of the conversation. That afternoon, Donna went into the main house at Graceland and made her way to Elvis's grandmother's room, Minnie Me, the woman who had been a fixture of this family through every chapter of its impossible story. Donna knelt beside her chair, the way she always did, and told her what Vernon had said. And the grandmother's response was identical in its instruction and devastating in what it confirmed. She said she knew. She said leave it alone. She said let Vernon handle it. She already knew. The women in that family, Elvis's grandmother, Elvis's aunt, already knew what Vernon believed, and every one of them had arrived at the same position. Silence and distance, and trust that Vernon would handle whatever needed to be handled in whatever way he saw fit. What this means, when you sit with it long enough, is that Vernon Presley was not operating in isolation. He was not a solitary grieving father spinning conspiracy theories in the quiet of his private pain. The people closest to him, the women who had known Elvis his entire life and loved him in the way that only the people who were there from the very beginning can love someone, they knew what he believed, and none of them disputed it. None of them tried to talk him out of it. None of them offered the comforting counter-argument that this was just grief looking for somewhere to go. They accepted it, they protected it, and they told Donna to do the same. Then there is the matter of what Vernon suspected. He had told Donna he had his suspicions, specific ones, formed by the sharp and careful attention of a man who had spent his entire life watching his son and watching the people around his son. He mentioned the changes Elvis had been planning. Changes to the people in his professional life, changes to the structure of the world he had built around himself. Elvis had apparently been more serious about these changes than he had ever been before, more decisive, more resolved, more ready to act. And Vernon seemed to believe, or at least to wonder, whether someone in that circle had understood what those changes would mean for them. Whether someone had been afraid enough of losing what Elvis's world had given them to do something about it before Elvis could follow through. He did not name anyone, not to Donna, but he had already made it clear that he intended to pursue this through his own means, in his own way, on his own timeline. And somewhere in the property, locked away with the kind of deliberate intention that does not happen by accident, were documents. Papers that Vernon had sealed himself, with instructions that they were not to be opened until 50 years after Elvis's death. That date is 2 years away. Whatever Vernon knew, whatever he found, whatever he confirmed, whatever he was never quite able to prove, may be sitting in those pages right now, waiting. Donna Presley kept her word. For years, long, ordinary, accumulating years, she carried what Vernon had told her, and she did not put it down in front of anyone, not because she had forgotten it. You do not forget something like that. It does not fade the way most memories do, softening at the edges over time until what remains is more feeling than fact. This stayed sharp. This stayed exactly the way it landed on that morning in the office, with the light through the window and Vernon's voice saying the word he said. She just chose, day after day and year after year, to keep it inside the perimeter of her own life and go no further with it. Then in 1997, she co-wrote a book. It was called Elvis, Precious Memories, a title that signals warmth and nostalgia, the kind of remembrance that fans reach for when they want to feel close to someone they lost. And within it, almost quietly, Donna let something slip through. Not the full story, not Vernon's exact words or the weight of that morning or the way her mother had ended the conversation with a warning about her children. Just an illusion. A shadow of the truth, present enough that someone paying close attention might pause over it, but deniable enough that it could be walked back if necessary. It was the closest she had come, in 2 decades, to saying out loud what she actually knew. Someone came to her after the book and told her that Vernon had recanted, that he had walked back what he believed or what he had said or both. Donna's response to this was instant and unambiguous. No, he did not. He never said anything to her that suggested he had changed his position, and she was certain, absolutely certain, that if he had, she would have been one of the first people he told, because that is the kind of man he was. If he had arrived at a different conclusion, he would have said so with the same directness he had brought to saying the original one. The recantation never happened, not to her, not in any conversation she was part of, and she was not willing to let that version of events stand unchallenged. There is also the matter of Ginger Alden, the woman who was with Elvis on the day he died, the woman who found him, the woman whose name has appeared in nearly every account of that afternoon. What most people do not know, or did not know until Ginger wrote about it herself, is that Vernon questioned her, privately, not through lawyers, not through any formal process, but directly and personally, in the quiet way that Vernon handled everything he considered to be family business. What he asked her exactly has never been fully disclosed, but the fact that he asked, the fact that the questioning happened at all, tells you something about where his mind was and how seriously he was pursuing whatever answers he believed were still available to find. Vernon Presley died in 1979, the same year Donna had started working beside him. He did not live long enough to see the sealed papers opened. He did not live long enough to find out whether whatever he had privately investigated ever produced something he could hold in his hands and call proof. What he left behind was a belief, and a set of locked documents, and the memory of a man who sat at a window every morning and looked at his son's grave and refused, even in the quietest and most private parts of himself, to accept the official story. That is the true cost of this silence, not just that the truth, if there is a single truth to find, has been withheld, but that a father spent every remaining day of his life inside the weight of what he believed and could not prove, and died still carrying it, that the women around him knew and said nothing, that Donna held it for decades before she finally allowed herself to say it plainly. Power has a way of making silence feel like the only reasonable choice. And sometimes, by the time the silence finally breaks, the people who needed to speak most are already gone. The papers open in 2 years. Whatever Vernon sealed inside them, answers, suspicions, names, nothing at all, we will know soon enough. Vernon Presley locked something away for 50 years, and that window is almost closed. If those sealed documents reveal even a fraction of what he believed, this story will never look the same again. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when 2027 arrives, we will be right here.